Chapter 1. Whispers in the Frost. The first snow of December descended softly, blanketing the world in a crisp, glistening white. Each flake fell with a sense of quiet purpose, as though carrying messages meant for no one in particular, but destined to be felt by all. In the small town of Silver Pines, the arrival of winter was always a moment of magic. Icicles clung to the edges of rooftops like frozen chandeliers, and the streets, lined with gas lamps adorned with evergreen wreaths, seemed to glow faintly under the waning light of the sun. It was a scene that could have been plucked from an old postcard, one of those timeless images that somehow held the promise of warmth amidst the chill. Amelia Clark stood at her frosted window, a steaming mug of tea warming her hands. She was a woman of quiet routines, her days spent in the modest house she had inherited from her grandmother. It was a home steeped in memory, filled with trinkets and photographs from lives long past. The sight of the snow stirred something in her, a faint longing she couldn't quite place. It wasn't just the season. It was something deeper, an ache that had been growing in the silence of her days. Across town, nestled on the corner of Maple Street, was a small post office. To anyone else, it was an unremarkable building, its weathered brick facade blending seamlessly into the quaint charm of Silver Pines. But to Amelia, it had always been a place of quiet significance. This was where she went every year to send her letter, a tradition she had never broken, not even in the loneliest years. It was not a letter addressed to family or friends, but to someone who existed in the fragile boundaries between belief and hope. Santa Claus. The ritual had begun in her childhood, back when her mother would sit beside her, guiding her small hands as she scrawled her wishes on delicate parchment. Over the years, the request had changed, becoming less about toys and more about intangible things. Love, happiness, a sense of belonging. Even as an adult, Amelia found comfort in the act of writing. It was her way of confiding in the universe, of releasing words she couldn't say aloud. The letter for this year sat on her desk, sealed in an envelope bearing her elegant handwriting. She hadn't dared to open it once it was written, as though doing so might dilute its power. The words within were personal, raw, and tinged with vulnerability. For the first time, Amelia had asked not for material things or even for her own peace, but for something that felt impossibly large. A connection, a meeting of souls that would remind her she wasn't as alone as she felt. As the snow fell heavier, Amelia wrapped herself in a thick scarf and coat, preparing to make her way to the post office. The air outside was sharp with the scent of pine and wood smoke, and her boots crunched softly against the fresh powder. Silver Pines was quiet, its residents tucked into their homes, their windows aglow with golden light. It was the kind of stillness that felt almost sacred, as though the world had paused just for her. The post office was empty when she arrived, save for a single clerk who greeted her with a polite nod. Amelia approached the counter, handing over her letter with a sense of ceremony. The clerk, a middle-aged man with kind eyes, weighed it carefully before affixing the stamp. As the envelope disappeared into the metal chute, Amelia felt a familiar mix of relief and uncertainty. It was done, sent off into the ether, to wherever such letters went. On her way back home, Amelia paused on the edge of the town square. A large Christmas tree stood at its center, its branches adorned with twinkling lights and ornaments that shimmered like captured stars. She watched as the lights reflected on the snow, creating a kaleidoscope of colors that danced in the periphery of her vision. For a moment, she allowed herself to believe in the magic of the season, in the possibility that her words might find their way to someone who understood. Miles away, in a cluttered workshop tucked deep within the forest, a man named Elias Hart sifted through a pile of letters. Elias was not Santa Claus, nor did he have any claim to the title, but for reasons he could barely articulate, He had spent years retrieving the letters discarded by the postal service, the ones addressed to a mythical figure. He read them, kept them, sometimes even answered them. It was his way of connecting with a world that had long since left him behind. Among the pile of envelopes, his hand paused over one that felt different. It was simple but elegant, the handwriting deliberate and full of care. As he opened it and began to read, the words resonated with him in a way that few had. There was a sincerity in the writer's request, a vulnerability that mirrored something buried within himself. Elias folded the letter carefully, setting it aside as he stared out the window at the falling snow. He didn't know the woman who had written it, but he felt as though, in some way, he already did. And for the first time in years, he felt the faint stirrings of something he had thought lost. The desire to reach out, to bridge the gap between solitude and connection. Back in Silver Pines, Amelia lit a single candle in her window, a beacon of warmth against the cold. As she settled into bed, she couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted, that the letter she had sent might somehow find its way to the right hands. And as the snow continued to fall, the whispers in the frost carried promises only the season could keep. Chapter 2. Ink on Winter's Canvas. The snow continued to fall relentlessly, transforming the small town into a quilt of white serenity. Elizabeth sat by the window of her modest cottage, her fingers tracing absent-mindedly over the edges of an envelope. The stationery before her was pristine, adorned with a faint imprint of holly leaves, a delicate nod to the season. Beside it rested a fountain pen, its ink as black as midnight, waiting to spill secrets onto the page. The idea of writing a letter to Santa had first seemed whimsical, almost absurd, for a woman in her mid-30s. Yet, as December crept forward, the ritual became less about belief in magic and more about the catharsis of confiding in someone, or something that might simply listen. She couldn't remember the last time she had shared her innermost thoughts, unfiltered and unjudged. The letter was to be her confessional, an unspoken wish, sent not to the North Pole but to the ether of hope itself. Elizabeth's mind wandered to the letters she used to write as a child. Her mother would help her craft sentences, urging her to dream big. Ask for the stars, Lizzie, even if all you want is a doll. Those memories, golden and bittersweet, haunted her as she picked up the pen. The act of writing felt sacred, as though each stroke could stitch a fragment of her fractured heart. Outside, the town square bustled with the rhythm of December. Children darted between stalls, clutching candy canes and hot cocoa, their laughter a sharp contrast to the quiet melancholy Elizabeth felt. Carolers stood near the fountain, their voices weaving harmonies that filled the air with nostalgia. She could hear their distant strains of Silent Night through the frosted glass, a melody that seemed to echo her solitude rather than alleviate it. In another corner of the town, Nicholas Green was experiencing a December unlike any he had ever known. His bookstore, a haven of worn pages and whispered stories, had become his entire world since moving here 2 years ago. Nicholas had never intended to settle in this quaint town. It had been a spur-of-the-moment decision made in the wake of a life unraveling. The shop was a refuge, a place where stories could be shelved and forgotten, much like his own. That afternoon, Nicholas was reorganizing a display of holiday books when a particular envelope caught his eye. It was tucked beneath a stack of classics, its red wax seal barely visible against the gold-trimmed paper. He recognized it immediately. It was one of the Christmas letter kits he had started selling a few weeks ago, inspired by an old tradition his grandmother had shared with him. He had encouraged his customers to write letters to Santa, not as an act of belief, but as a moment of reflection. The envelope bore no address, only the words to Santa scrawled in an elegant hand. He turned it over, his curiosity piqued. It was unsealed, and though his instinct was to leave it be, something compelled him to open it. Inside was a single sheet of paper, its words few but weighted with emotion. "All I want this Christmas is to remember what it feels like to believe." The simplicity of the message struck him like a chord played on an old piano, its resonance lingering long after the sound had faded. He folded the letter carefully, slipping it back into the envelope. There was no name, no indication of the sender's identity, but it didn't matter. The words felt intimate, as though they belonged to anyone who had ever felt the ache of losing something intangible. Elizabeth, unaware of the impact her simple message had already begun to stir, set down her pen and exhaled. She had written the words quickly, almost without thought, as if they had been waiting inside her all along. The act of sealing the envelope brought her a small sense of closure, a step toward reclaiming something she couldn't quite name. As dusk fell, she bundled up and walked to the town's postbox near the square. The Christmas lights twinkled overhead, their glow warm against the growing chill. She hesitated for a moment, the envelope trembling in her gloved hand. Then, with a deep breath, she let it fall into the box, unaware that the simple act of dropping a letter would set a series of events into motion that would change more than just her December. Far away, under the same canopy of winter stars, Nicholas placed the letter on his shop's counter, a small smile tugging at the corners of his lips. He didn't know what he would do with it yet, but the words had found a home in his heart, igniting a spark he hadn't felt in years. Somewhere between the ink and the paper, two lives had begun to weave together, their threads invisible but unbreakable. The snow continued to fall, wrapping the world in its quiet embrace as the first fragments of their stories began to intertwine. Chapter 3. The Silent Echo of Wishes. The morning dawned with a pale light, the kind that filtered softly through the thick quilt of snow-laden clouds. The town seemed to stir more slowly than usual, muffled by the hush that fresh snowfall brings. Elizabeth watched the world outside her window, her breath fogging the glass as she traced aimless patterns on its frosted surface. The previous night's letter had left her with a curious mix of release and anticipation, though she told herself it was merely a symbolic gesture, a fleeting moment of catharsis, not a harbinger of change. Her cottage felt impossibly still, the kind of silence that pressed against her ears like a held breath. The Christmas tree in the corner, though sparsely decorated, exuded a faint pine aroma, its branches heavy with ornaments collected over years that now felt distant. On the mantel above her modest fireplace, a row of holiday cards from well-meaning acquaintances reminded her of the life she had carefully curated. Friendly, polite, but ultimately solitary. Outside, the streets were alive with activity. Shopkeepers swept their stoops, their brooms cutting clean paths through the snow. Children wrapped in vibrant scarves built lopsided snowmen on the green, their giggles carrying on the crisp wind. Above it all, the faint chime of the church bell told the hour, a sound as familiar as her own heartbeat. Elizabeth pulled on her boots and coat, deciding that a walk through town might do her good. She stuffed her hands into her pockets, where the faint crinkle of a forgotten candy wrapper made her smile briefly, a small reminder of childhood indulgences. Meanwhile, Nicholas had also found himself in a pensive mood. The letter he had discovered the day before lingered in his mind like a line from a favorite book, its simplicity somehow haunting. As he opened his shop for the day, he placed the envelope on the counter, its presence both a curiosity and a puzzle he hadn't yet decided how to solve. The shop smelled of aged paper and cinnamon, the latter courtesy of a candle he had lit to add to the seasonal ambience. Shelves crammed with books stretched toward the ceiling, their spines creating a tapestry of muted colors. A small display near the entrance showcased Christmas titles, their covers adorned with snowflakes, holly, and festive reds and greens. Despite the cheerfulness of the decorations, Nicholas couldn't shake the weight of the letter's words. All I want this Christmas is to remember what it feels like to believe. The morning brought a few customers, their footsteps echoing softly against the wooden floorboards. An older woman purchased a collection of Christmas poetry, while a young boy shyly selected a storybook about reindeer. Nicholas moved through these transactions with practiced ease, but his mind was elsewhere. As the last customer of the hour exited, leaving the shop momentarily empty, he returned to the letter. He wondered who had written it. The hand was elegant but not pretentious, the ink bold but not heavy. It felt like the kind of handwriting that belonged to someone who once wrote often but had since let the habit fall away. Nicholas found himself imagining the author, a woman, perhaps, judging by the soft curves of the script. She might be someone like himself, carrying the quiet weight of an unspoken longing. The thought gave him a strange sense of connection, though he knew nothing of her life. Elizabeth's walk had taken her to the town square, where she meandered through the marketplace. Stalls offered an array of wares, handmade ornaments, jars of preserves, and scarves in every color imaginable. She lingered at a booth selling wreaths, her fingers brushing the prickly greenery as she admired the craftsmanship. Despite the bustle around her, she felt oddly disconnected, as though she were observing the world from behind a pane of glass. Her wandering feet eventually brought her to the bookstore. The warmth of the shop enveloped her the moment she stepped inside, the air scented with cinnamon and the unmistakable musk of books. She had been here only a handful of times before, usually to pick up a novel for a quiet evening. Today, she wasn't looking for anything in particular, but the idea of being surrounded by stories felt comforting. Nicholas noticed her immediately, though she didn't seem to notice him. She moved with a quiet grace, her gloved hands trailing along the spines of books as though searching for one that might call to her. Her coat was dusted with snow, her scarf slightly askew, and for a moment, he thought she looked as though she had stepped out of the pages of a story herself. Elizabeth paused at a shelf near the counter, where a small sign read, "Write your Christmas wish." It was accompanied by a stack of the same letter kits Nicholas had used to create the display. She picked one up, her brow furrowing as she studied it. The gesture felt almost surreal, an echo of her own actions from the night before. She hesitated, then placed the kit back on the shelf, her expression unreadable. Nicholas, ever observant, felt a flicker of recognition. He couldn't explain why, but something about her drew him in. Her thoughtful movements, the faint melancholy in her eyes. He wondered if she might be the author of the letter, though he dismissed the thought almost as quickly as it came. The town was full of people. It could have been anyone. As Elizabeth browsed, she found herself lingering longer than she had intended. The shop felt like a cocoon, a place where time slowed and the weight of the outside world could be momentarily forgotten. She selected a book, a collection of winter tales, and brought it to the counter. Nicholas rang up the purchase, their interaction polite and fleeting, yet underpinned by an unspoken connection neither of them fully understood. Later that evening, as Elizabeth settled into her armchair with her new book and Nicholas closed the shop for the night, they both found their thoughts drifting to the same place. The fragile threads of hope and belief that tied people together, even when they didn't realize it. Outside, the snow fell softly, wrapping the town in its timeless, whispering embrace. Chapter 4. Envelopes of Hope. The morning broke with a quiet stillness, the kind that only the heart of winter can bring. Elizabeth awoke to the faint glow of sunlight filtering through her curtains, illuminating her modest bedroom with a pale golden hue. Outside, the snow had woven a pristine blanket across the landscape, each tree and rooftop adorned with glistening frost. She sat up slowly, the weight of the past few days lingering like a shadow in the corners of her mind. The memory of her letter to Santa, tucked away in a place meant to hold forgotten wishes, lingered like an unresolved melody. She moved through her morning routine with a practiced rhythm, though her mind was far from her tasks. The kettle whistled softly as she prepared her tea, the steam curling like wisps of a fading dream. She wrapped herself in a thick shawl and carried her mug to the window, where she stood for a long moment, staring at the world outside. The square was coming to life with the usual bustle of the holiday season. Children dragging sleds, vendors setting up their stalls, and the distant toll of the church bell marking the hour. Yet amidst the cheer, Elizabeth felt an ache she couldn't quite name. Meanwhile, across town, Nicholas prepared his shop for another day. He arrived early, as he often did, savoring the quiet hours before customers filled the space. The letter still lay on the counter, a tangible reminder of the mystery that had found its way into his life. He had resisted the urge to write a response, unsure if doing so would feel intrusive. Instead, he had decided to let the letter remain where it was, a secret shared between him and the ether. The shop exuded its usual warmth, the scent of aged paper mingling with the cinnamon candle he lit each morning. Nicholas took his time rearranging the shelves, pausing now and then to flip through a book or straighten a display. His hands lingered over the stack of Christmas stationery near the counter, where the sign inviting customers to write your Christmas wish stood as a quiet challenge. The thought of who might have written the mysterious letter occupied his mind more than he cared to admit. He wondered if its author had come into the shop before, if perhaps she had stood in this very room, looking for something more than a book. Elizabeth found herself drawn to the marketplace that day, her footsteps crunching softly against the snow-packed streets. She wandered through the stalls, the festive atmosphere brushing against the edges of her solitude. Vendors called out cheerful greetings, their voices mingling with the laughter of children and the occasional bark of a dog. She paused at a stall selling hand-carved ornaments, her fingers tracing the delicate details of an angel's wings. The vendor, an older man with kind eyes, smiled warmly at her, but she offered only a polite nod before moving on. Her wandering brought her back to the bookstore, almost without her realizing it. The shop's window display, adorned with twinkling fairy lights and stacks of holiday-themed books, beckoned her inside. The bell above the door jingled softly as she entered, and she was greeted by the familiar warmth of the space. Nicholas glanced up from behind the counter, his expression neutral but his eyes flickering with recognition. Elizabeth moved through the aisles with a purposeful slowness, her hand brushing against the spines of books as though searching for something she couldn't name. Her attention was drawn to a small table near the back, where a single book lay open, its pages illuminated by a nearby lamp. The book was an old volume of Christmas letters, each page filled with the wishes and dreams of people from decades past. Elizabeth sat down at the table, her fingers tracing the delicate script of a letter written by a young girl in 1923. The child had wished for a doll and a warm coat for her mother, her words simple yet achingly sincere. Elizabeth felt a lump form in her throat, the weight of her own unspoken wishes pressing against her chest. As she read, Nicholas watched her from a distance, his curiosity growing. He had placed the book on the table earlier that morning, drawn to its quiet charm and the idea of preserving the voices of the past. Seeing Elizabeth engrossed in its pages stirred something in him, a sense of connection, though he couldn't explain why. He busied himself with tasks around the shop, stealing glances in her direction as he worked. Elizabeth left the shop that day with the book tucked under her arm, its fragile pages feeling like a bridge between her present and the past. She didn't know why she had chosen it, only that it felt like something she needed to read. Back at home, she settled into her favorite armchair, the fire crackling softly in the hearth. The book opened in her lap, and she let herself be carried away by the voices of strangers, their words weaving a tapestry of hope, love, and longing. That night, as the snow fell softly outside. Elizabeth found herself writing another letter. This time, her words came more easily, her pen gliding across the page with a quiet determination. She didn't know if anyone would ever read it or if it would join the first letter in its lonely anonymity, but for the first time in years, she felt a spark of something she couldn't quite name. Perhaps it was hope, fragile and tentative, but undeniably present. Across town, Nicholas closed up the shop for the night, the letter still resting on the counter like an unanswered question. He stared at it for a long moment, then picked it up and slipped it into his coat pocket. Outside, the town lay shrouded in silence, the snow transforming the familiar streets into something almost magical. Nicholas walked home with the letter close to his heart, the faint glow of the Christmas lights guiding his way. Unbeknownst to them both, their lives were slowly intertwining, the threads of their stories drawing closer with each passing day. The letters they wrote, the books they read, and the unspoken wishes they carried were all part of a quiet symphony, its melody unfolding beneath the northern sky. Chapter 5. Shadows Beneath the Holly. The next day arrived with a gray, overcast sky that hung low over the town, casting a muted light across the snow-covered streets. Elizabeth stood at her kitchen window, watching as soft flakes began to fall again, dusting the rooftops and lampposts. The book she had borrowed from the bookstore rested on the small table beside her, its worn cover a quiet reminder of the previous day's discoveries. The letters within its pages had lingered in her thoughts through the night, their words weaving themselves into her dreams. She turned away from the window and picked up the book, cradling it in her hands as she carried it to her favorite armchair by the fire. The warmth of the flames reached out to her, a soothing balm against the chill that seemed to have settled into her very bones. As she opened the book to where she had left off, the scent of aged paper and ink rose to meet her, transporting her once again to a world of voices from the past. The letters were from people long gone, their hopes and fears etched onto fragile pages. A soldier had written to his sweetheart, promising to return by Christmas if fate allowed. A mother had penned a plea for her family's safety, her love for her children spilling out in every line. Elizabeth read each letter with a growing sense of wonder and melancholy, as though she were piecing together fragments of a forgotten history. She paused on one particular letter, its handwriting delicate and precise. It was dated December 12, 1919, and signed simply Clara. In the letter, Clara described a love she had kept hidden, a love she feared would never be returned. She had written to Santa as though he were her confidant, entrusting him with the secret she dared not speak aloud. Elizabeth felt her chest tighten as she read, the raw vulnerability of Clara's words resonating deeply within her. She wondered what had become of Clara and whether her unspoken love had ever found a voice. Meanwhile, across town, Nicholas was also thinking about letters. The one that had appeared in his shop, mysterious and unclaimed, still occupied a corner of his mind. He had tucked it into a drawer beneath the counter, telling himself that he would leave it there for a little longer, just in case its author returned. But as the days passed, he found himself drawn to it, unable to shake the feeling that it held a significance he couldn't quite grasp. That morning, as he prepared the shop for another day, Nicholas decided to revisit the letter. He pulled it from the drawer and unfolded it carefully, his eyes scanning the neatly written words. The letter was heartfelt and earnest, its tone both hopeful and wistful. It spoke of a desire for connection, for something true and enduring. Nicholas found himself wondering about the person who had written it. Had they walked through his shop, their face blending into the crowd? Or had they remained unseen, a ghostly presence in the background? As he folded the letter and slipped it back into the drawer, Nicholas resolved to keep it safe. Perhaps its writer would return, or perhaps the letter was meant to stay with him, a small mystery to ponder during the quiet moments of his days. Elizabeth, unaware that her words had found a temporary home in Nicholas's shop, spent the afternoon wandering through the woods behind her cottage. The snow had transformed the familiar landscape into a pristine, silent world, the trees standing like sentinels against the pale sky. She carried the book with her, its weight a comforting presence in her hands. She found a fallen log near a frozen stream and sat down, the crisp air brushing against her cheeks as she opened the book once more. The forest seemed to hold its breath as she read, the only sound the faint rustle of pages as she turned them. She felt a kinship with the people who had written these letters, their lives separated from hers by time, but connected by the universal threads of love, longing, and hope. For the first time in years, she felt the stirrings of something she had thought lost, a quiet, fragile sense of possibility. Back in town, Nicholas spent the day tending to his customers, his interactions punctuated by the occasional glance at the drawer where the letter lay hidden. He wondered what Elizabeth was doing, though he didn't yet know her name. He had noticed her in the shop, her quiet presence standing out amidst the holiday bustle. There was something about her that intrigued him, a subtle aura of mystery that seemed to surround her. As evening fell, Elizabeth returned home, her cheeks pink from the cold and her heart a little lighter than it had been that morning. She placed the book on the table beside her armchair and lit a candle, its soft glow filling the room with a golden warmth. She sat down at her desk, her fingers hovering over a blank sheet of paper. For a long moment, she hesitated, unsure of what to write. Then, with a deep breath, she began to put her thoughts into words. She didn't address the letter to anyone, nor did she sign it. Instead, she poured her feelings onto the page, her pen moving with a quiet urgency. She wrote about the letters she had read, about the lives they had revealed to her. She wrote about the loneliness she had carried for so long and the faint flicker of hope she now felt. When she finished, she folded the letter carefully and placed it in an envelope, sealing it with a touch of wax. The letter sat on her desk as she prepared for bed, its presence both comforting and daunting. She didn't know what she would do with it, or if she would ever find the courage to send it. But for now, it was enough to have written it, to have given her feelings a voice. Outside, the snow continued to fall, blanketing the town in a soft, hushed silence. The world seemed to hold its breath, as though waiting for something to unfold. In the quiet of her room, Elizabeth lay down to sleep, her thoughts drifting toward the unknown paths that lay ahead. And in his shop, Nicholas locked up for the night, his mind lingering on the letter in his drawer and the mysteries it held. The threads of their lives were drawing closer, weaving a tapestry of moments that neither of them could yet see. And in the stillness of the snowy night, the story of their connection began to take shape, one letter at a time. Chapter 6. The Candle's Faint Glow. The next morning, a brilliant winter sun poured over the town, casting diamonds of light across the snow-laden rooftops. Elizabeth awoke with a sense of quiet determination, her gaze falling immediately on the envelope that rested on her desk. Its edges caught the sunlight, and for a moment, it seemed almost to glow. She rose slowly, the weight of the letter's words still heavy in her mind. She hadn't slept well, her thoughts racing with doubts about what she had written. Yet, a part of her felt lighter, as though the simple act of putting pen to paper had shifted something deep within her. Elizabeth walked to the desk and traced the edge of the envelope with her fingers. She made a decision. This letter was meant to leave her hands, even if she didn't know where it would ultimately land. Wrapping herself in a thick coat and scarf, she tucked the envelope into her pocket and stepped outside. The crisp air hit her cheeks, invigorating her as she made her way toward the town. Snow crunched underfoot, and the occasional bird chirped from the skeletal branches above, their calls a reminder that even winter held moments of life. Elizabeth didn't have a particular destination in mind. She only knew she wanted the letter to reach someone who might understand its meaning. As she passed through the cobblestone streets, she caught sight of the post office. Its cheerful red door stood out against the monochrome of the snowy landscape. Hesitating for a moment, she walked to the mailbox just outside the building. It was an ordinary metal box, its surface worn smooth by years of use. Elizabeth reached into her pocket and withdrew the envelope. She stared at it for a long moment, her breath clouding in the frigid air. Finally, with a quick motion, she slid the letter into the slot. The sound of it dropping inside echoed faintly, a tiny but significant punctuation marked to her morning. As Elizabeth walked away, her heart beat faster, a mixture of apprehension and relief coursing through her. She didn't know what she expected to happen, or even if anything would, but she felt as though she had sent a piece of herself into the world, a small offering to the unknown. Unbeknownst to her, the letter's journey was only beginning. Inside the post office, the mail sorter, a kindly older man named Walter, collected the morning's deposits. He sorted them with practiced ease, his fingers deftly separating bills, postcards, and personal letters. When he came to Elizabeth's envelope, something about it gave him pause. There was no return address, only a simple stamp and the town's postmark. The handwriting was elegant and deliberate, as though the writer had taken great care in crafting their words. Walter set the letter aside, intending to investigate it later. But as the hours passed, the steady stream of customers demanded his attention, and the envelope was eventually placed in a stack to be sent with the day's outgoing mail. It wasn't long before it was loaded onto a delivery truck bound for the larger distribution center in the next city. Meanwhile, across town, Nicholas was once again absorbed in his shop. The morning sunlight spilled through the windows, illuminating rows of books and trinkets. The letter in his drawer remained untouched, but its presence continued to linger in his thoughts. He often found his gaze drifting toward the counter, wondering if its author would ever return. His day unfolded in quiet rhythms, punctuated by the occasional customer browsing the shelves. As he straightened a row of books near the front of the store, his thoughts turned once more to the unknown woman who had entered his shop several days earlier. There had been something about her, a stillness, a depth, that had left an impression. Nicholas allowed himself a small smile as he considered the mysteries surrounding him. Between the enigmatic letter and the strange sense of familiarity he felt toward the woman, he couldn't help but feel that something was shifting in his life. It was as though the season itself held secrets, waiting to be revealed. By evening, the snow had begun to fall again, soft and persistent. The letter Elizabeth had mailed was now miles away, traveling through the intricate web of the postal system. It passed through sorting machines and into the hands of workers who handled it briefly before sending it on its way. Each step brought it closer to its eventual destination, though its final recipient remained unknown. Elizabeth spent the evening by her fire, her thoughts quieter now that the letter was no longer in her possession. She occupied herself with small tasks, folding laundry, rearranging books on her shelves, but her mind kept returning to the mailbox and the faint clink of the envelope dropping inside. It was a sound she knew she wouldn't forget, a moment that felt both ordinary and profound. In his shop, Nicholas locked up for the night, the streets outside quiet and serene under the blanket of snow. He stood for a moment on the threshold, watching as the flakes fell, each one a tiny miracle against the darkening sky. His thoughts turned once more to the mysteries around him. The letter in his drawer, the woman who had stirred his curiosity, the subtle sense of something waiting just out of reach. As the town settled into its nightly hush, the threads of Elizabeth's and Nicholas's lives continued to weave closer together, though neither of them could yet see the pattern taking shape. The letter, now far from its origin, carried with it a piece of Elizabeth's heart, its destination uncertain, but its journey filled with quiet possibility. And under the falling snow, the promise of connection lingered in the air, as fragile and beautiful as the season itself. Chapter 7. Secrets Bound in Red String. The town lay beneath a thick blanket of snow, its streets shimmering under the pale glow of the moon. The frost crept over windows, weaving delicate patterns like frozen lace, as though the winter itself sought to decorate the world. In this quiet landscape, life continued its gentle rhythm, though the season had imbued it with a sense of solemnity and reflection. Elizabeth stood at her window, her fingers curled around a steaming cup of tea. The warmth seeped into her palms, a small comfort against the chill that lingered in the air. The night outside was still, the world hushed as if holding its breath. She let her gaze drift over the snow-covered rooftops, her thoughts meandering in the same way. The letter she had sent weighed on her mind, though it was no longer within her power to control its journey. She wondered where it might be now, if it had already passed through the hands of strangers, or if it was still lying in a bin, waiting to be sorted. The thought of the letter, a physical representation of her innermost feelings, brought a curious mixture of relief and vulnerability. She had released something into the world, trusting that it would find its place, even if she couldn't predict the outcome. Down the road, Nicholas was similarly lost in thought. His shop was dark, the shutters drawn against the icy wind that had begun to stir. He sat at his desk, the letter Elizabeth had left still resting in its drawer. He hadn't opened it yet, though the urge to do so grew stronger with each passing day. Something about the letter felt sacred, as if to read it carelessly would diminish its significance. Nicholas reached for the drawer but hesitated, his hand hovering just above the handle. The shop was silent except for the faint creaks of the old building settling into the cold night. He let his hand fall back to his lap and leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling. The mystery of the letter was both a comfort and a torment, a puzzle he couldn't yet bring himself to solve. The days that followed brought a series of small but profound changes. Elizabeth found herself drawn to the post office, her walks often leading her past its cheerful red door. She never entered, unwilling to disturb the process she had already set in motion. Instead, she would linger on the corner, her scarf pulled tightly around her neck, and watch as others came and went, their letters and parcels in tow. Each time she saw the door swing open, she felt a flicker of hope, imagining her letter among the hundreds traveling to distant places. For Nicholas, the shop became a place of introspection. He spent his days organizing books, rearranging displays, and tending to the few customers who braved the snow-covered streets. Yet, his thoughts always returned to the letter. He began to notice patterns in the books people purchased, stories of longing, connection, and change. It felt as though the universe were sending him signs, nudging him towards something he couldn't quite name. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of gold and indigo, Nicholas found himself standing at the counter, the letter in his hand. The shop was empty, the last customer having left hours ago, and the stillness of the room seemed to magnify the weight of the envelope. He traced the edges with his fingertips, feeling the slight ridges of the paper beneath his touch. He thought of the woman who had left it behind, her eyes shadowed with a depth he couldn't forget. She had carried something within her, a story, a feeling that she hadn't yet spoken aloud. Nicholas felt a strange kinship with her, as though they were two threads in the same tapestry, destined to cross but uncertain of when. Meanwhile, Elizabeth sat at her desk, her journal open before her. She had taken to writing more often, filling the pages with thoughts and dreams she had kept locked away for too long. The act of writing felt like a balm, soothing the restless parts of her spirit. She wrote about the winter, the beauty of the snow, and the quiet magic of the season. But most of all, she wrote about connection. The kind that transcends words, carried instead in gestures, glances, and unspoken understanding. Her pen paused over the page, and she glanced at the calendar on her wall. Christmas was drawing closer, the days slipping past with a quiet urgency. She felt a strange mixture of anticipation and melancholy, as though she were standing on the edge of something she couldn't yet see. The letter, now far from her hands, felt like a thread connecting her to the unknown, a possibility waiting to unfold. In the heart of the postal system, her letter continued its journey. It passed through sorting facilities and into the hands of workers who handled it with care, each step bringing it closer to its destination. The letter, unassuming and ordinary in appearance, carried within it the essence of Elizabeth's heart, a whisper of hope, longing, and the quiet courage to be seen. As the snow continued to fall, blanketing the world in its gentle embrace, the lives of Elizabeth and Nicholas moved in parallel, their paths inching closer with each passing day. The letter, a bridge between them, traveled onward, its presence a silent promise of what was yet to come. And in the stillness of the winter night, under the watchful gaze of the stars, the seeds of something extraordinary began to take root, waiting patiently for the right moment to bloom. Chapter 8. Snowflakes and Hidden Sorrows. The days were shortening now, as December's deep chill settled more heavily over the town. It was as if time itself had slowed, thickened by the weight of winter's breath. Elizabeth often found herself walking the streets in silence, wrapped in layers of wool and woolen scarves, her eyes trained on the ground beneath her feet. The snow was untouched, a soft blanket that made the world feel distant, like a quiet dream. The holidays were approaching in their usual fashion, but this year there was an undercurrent of something different, a sense of change that neither Elizabeth nor Nicholas could entirely explain. It hung in the air, pressing down on their hearts, shaping their thoughts in ways they couldn't predict. The time was drawing near, and Elizabeth could feel it. A change was coming, though she couldn't yet say what it would look like, nor when it would finally arrive. As Christmas drew nearer, Elizabeth found herself returning to the post office more frequently. Each time, the building seemed more alive, its windows glowing with warm light as the bell chimed above the door. She never entered, only walked past with quick, purposeful steps, as though the mere act of passing it would bring her closer to something she couldn't fully comprehend. Though she hadn't received a response to her letter, she didn't let that discourage her. Instead, her focus had shifted elsewhere, toward the rhythm of the season, the gathering chill, the ways the town itself seemed to shift, as though it too could feel the pull of something unseen. The Christmas decorations were already up in the town square, the tree standing tall in the center, its branches wrapped in twinkling lights. The holiday cheer was infectious, but underneath, there was an undeniable tension. The scent of pine and cinnamon, the warmth of the hearths, all felt like something to hold on to, as if, by their very presence, they would ward off the coldness inside. Nicholas, too, felt the presence of change, though in his case, it gnawed at him more insistently. His dreams were filled with echoes of distant voices, memories long buried, and things half forgotten. He had closed the shop early that evening, too lost in thought to pay attention to the clock, his hands idly flipping through the pages of the books that lined the shelves. The letter lay heavy in his drawer, its contents still hidden from him, as though its very secrecy was a kind of waiting. Tonight, though, something was different. The weight of the letter seemed to pull at him more than ever. It was as if it were calling to him, its presence impossible to ignore any longer. For the first time since its arrival, Nicholas opened the drawer and slid it out. The paper was smooth beneath his fingertips, the edges worn slightly from handling. It was simple, unremarkable, except for the words that must lie inside. His pulse quickened as he held it in his hands, but still, he hesitated. Outside, The wind howled through the narrow streets, pushing the snowflakes against the windows like small shards of glass. The storm had picked up in intensity, creating a blur of white that made the world outside seem ghostly, as if it were being erased before his eyes. The shop was dark, the shadows of the books stretching long into the corners. The letter, so small in comparison to the vastness of the room, suddenly seemed like the most significant thing in his life. He finally slid his finger beneath the flap of the envelope, tearing it open with a soft, almost reverent motion. The letter inside was folded neatly, the edges crisp as if it had only just been written. His breath caught in his throat as he unfolded it, revealing the carefully written words, their elegant script a testament to the thought and care Elizabeth had put into them. He read, and as the words sank in, a sudden, profound understanding began to wash over him. The letter was not just a request, it was a revelation. The words on the page, though simple, were profound in their sincerity. They spoke of love, of longing, of a deep connection that neither could yet name, but that had been there all along. As he read, Nicholas felt something stirring inside him, an emotion long buried, now awakening with startling intensity. The letter didn't just ask for something. It opened the door to something else entirely, a possibility, a future, a path not yet taken but full of potential. The weight of it pressed against his chest, and he closed his eyes for a moment, allowing himself to breathe deeply, to take in the fullness of what this letter had stirred in him. The holiday season, which had once seemed like nothing more than a series of traditions, now felt like a threshold. And in that moment, Nicholas understood that the arrival of this letter had been no accident. It had been a message, a call, a sign. His hands trembled slightly as he folded the letter back and slid it into its envelope. The room was quiet, save for the low hum of the storm outside. For the first time in weeks, Nicholas felt a sense of clarity, as though a veil had been lifted and he could now see the world more clearly. Elizabeth had sent this letter with purpose. She had sent it because she, too, felt the pull of something greater than what they had known before. In the days that followed, both Elizabeth and Nicholas moved through their routines as if nothing had changed. But underneath, they were both altered. The world, too, seemed to shift in small but noticeable ways. Whispers in the wind, glimpses of something bright in the dark. The days were growing shorter, the evenings colder, and the promise of something more lingered in the spaces between them. But neither of them yet knew what the letter had truly set in motion. Neither knew that the smallest of gestures, the simple act of writing, of sending a letter, could transform everything. Still, the town continued its quiet winter dance, each day leading them closer to the turning point, to the moment when they would finally understand the power of the wishes they had placed in the hands of fate. And through it all, the wind continued to carry the soft scent of pine and promise, as though reminding them that even the smallest actions can shape the course of a life. Chapter 9. The postmark that changed everything. The winter days drifted into one another, as they always did at the cusp of December. Each day felt the same, quiet, slow, as the snow continued to blanket the town in soft, shimmering layers. Yet for Elizabeth and Nicholas, there was an undeniable shift that neither could ignore. The world outside might have remained unchanged, but something had subtly altered between them, something invisible and powerful that neither fully understood but both could feel. It was not that they had spoken of it, or even acknowledged it directly. The letter had not been mentioned again, nor had the idea it conveyed, of a future, of possibilities that stretched far beyond the simple confines of their lives. But beneath their interactions, between the exchanges of glances and the soft smiles, there was an understanding, a bond growing stronger with each passing day. Nicholas found himself drawn to the quiet moments more than ever. He would stand at his shop window in the evenings, watching the snowfall outside, the gentle flurries of white sweeping across the empty streets. The town was hushed, as if holding its breath. He often thought of Elizabeth during these moments, her quiet grace, the way she moved through the world, as though everything around her was part of some greater, unspoken harmony. It was an odd thing, the way life worked sometimes. There were moments when everything felt clear, when the path ahead seemed certain, and then there were moments like these, when the future was a shadow on the horizon, only half glimpsed. Nicholas couldn't decide if that was more thrilling or more terrifying. It felt as if they were waiting for something, waiting for the right moment, the right sign, for the world to reveal what was to come. Elizabeth, too, found herself restless in ways she couldn't quite name. The days were long, and yet she felt like they were slipping through her fingers, each one passing too quickly, as if the end of something was drawing near. She would walk through the streets, her mind drifting from thought to thought, her steps quick but distracted. Often, she would catch herself staring at the small shop where Nicholas worked, her gaze lingering on the snowflakes drifting past the windows, as if waiting for some signal from him that would help her make sense of the quiet pull she felt toward him. It was during one of these walks that Elizabeth happened to pass the post office again. As always, it seemed to pulse with a quiet, unspoken energy. There was something about it, something that called to her, though she couldn't say what. She paused for a moment, standing at the corner across the street, her eyes fixed on the building. The lights inside were soft, glowing with the warmth of the season. It looked so peaceful, so perfectly ordinary. Yet there was a sense of something greater, something waiting to be discovered. It was then that she noticed the envelope. At first, she thought it was just another letter, lost in the folds of time. Another piece of forgotten mail. But as she drew closer, her heart skipped a beat. The envelope was unmistakable. It was the one she had sent weeks before, the one she had poured so much of herself into. The handwriting on the outside was familiar, her own, and it carried the same weight of anticipation she had felt when she had written it. Elizabeth's pulse quickened, and without thinking, she crossed the street, moving toward the door of the post office. The snow crunched beneath her boots, but it seemed muffled by the strange stillness that had overtaken the world. The door of the post office opened easily, as though it were expecting her, and the familiar bell chimed softly as she stepped inside. The warmth of the room was almost overwhelming after the cold, and she took a moment to let the heat seep into her bones. The air was filled with the faint scent of ink and paper, mingling with the distant smell of pine and cinnamon. The atmosphere in the post office felt different today, somehow, richer, more alive, as if the letters themselves were waiting for something to unfold. Behind the counter stood the old postmaster, his weathered face framed by the bright lights, his hands busy sorting through a pile of letters. He glanced up as she entered, offering her a quiet smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Elizabeth felt a flutter of nerves in her stomach. She knew she was being ridiculous, but her heart had begun to race nonetheless. She approached the counter, her hand already reaching for the envelope that sat, so patiently, just waiting for her to take it. The postmaster watched her as she carefully slid it across the counter, his gaze unreadable. For a moment, the world felt entirely still. The wind howled outside, but inside, there was a quiet sort of peace that enveloped them both. Elizabeth's hand hovered over the envelope for a heartbeat longer before she took it. Her fingers brushed the edges, and the sensation sent a small ripple of excitement through her. As she turned to leave, the postmaster spoke, his voice low and hesitant. But it wasn't enough to break the spell that had fallen over her. She moved past him without a word, the envelope clutched tightly in her hands. There was something in the air now, something heavy, thick with meaning, as though this small act of retrieving the letter was the opening of a door, a step into a future that was finally starting to unfold. The walk home felt long, the weight of the envelope growing heavier with each step. Elizabeth's thoughts spiraled. What did this letter mean? What would Nicholas say? She had no answers yet, but the anticipation built with every footstep, every quiet, steady movement forward. She could feel the change in the air as if it was following her, and in that moment, she realized that nothing would ever be the same again. When she finally arrived home, the envelope sat on the kitchen table, its simple presence almost overwhelming. She sat down, her fingers trembling as she slowly peeled back the seal, unsure of what she would find inside. The paper crinkled slightly, and as it opened, she felt her heart race, her breath shallow. For the first time in weeks, Elizabeth allowed herself to hope, allowed herself to believe in the possibility of what lay beyond the letter. She unfolded it slowly, savoring the moment, the way the letter seemed to hum with life, with promise. And when her eyes fell on the words, her heart skipped a beat. The letter was not long, but it was enough. It was all she needed. Chapter 10. Tidings of an Unseen Hand. The wind had picked up by the time Elizabeth set the letter down on the kitchen table. She had read its contents multiple times, each time letting the words sink in deeper, carving paths into her thoughts that seemed to echo through her mind long after her eyes had left the paper. The room around her, the world outside, all felt distant, faintly surreal, as though she were suspended in a moment outside of time. The words were simple, yet they carried a weight far greater than anything she had ever encountered. They were not just words on a page. They were a turning point, a pivotal moment that demanded something of her. The letter had no return address, no signature, but its message was clear. If you want to find the answer, follow the lights. It was a strange request, cryptic in its simplicity, yet it resonated with a feeling she couldn't fully explain. For a moment, she just sat there, staring at the paper in front of her, trying to piece together its meaning. Her fingers, still lingering on the edges of the letter, felt the delicate, almost imperceptible folds of the page, as if the very letter itself held some secret she was yet to discover. She didn't know why, but she could feel a pull, something tugging at her, urging her to act. The silence of the room seemed to press in around her as her thoughts swirled. The winds outside whistled through the trees, their mournful cry a strange harmony with the chaos inside her mind. She couldn't understand why she felt so compelled to follow this cryptic trail, but something deep within her told her that she had no choice. The mystery of the letter, the words that spoke to her in ways that couldn't be explained, had somehow become part of her, woven into the fabric of who she was. She knew she had to follow the lights. The thought of Nicholas lingered on the edges of her mind. What would he think of this? Would he understand? The truth was, Elizabeth wasn't sure. She wasn't even sure she fully understood herself, but there was no mistaking the tug of destiny that seemed to beckon her. The feeling had been growing for weeks now, ever since she had sent her letter to Santa, and now this strange invitation to follow the lights felt like the culmination of everything she had been searching for. It felt as if her world, once predictable and quiet, was on the verge of transformation. After a long, drawn-out breath, Elizabeth pushed herself to her feet. The letter was still on the table, resting quietly, as if waiting for her to make the next move. She knew what she had to do. The lights. She had no idea where they might lead, but she understood that the journey was no longer just hers. It was a shared path, one that involved more than just her. Nicholas, too, had been drawn into this unspoken promise, even if neither of them had fully acknowledged it. With a sense of finality, Elizabeth placed the letter in her pocket, the weight of it now feeling strangely comforting, like a key to a door she was finally ready to open. The decision had been made. She didn't know what awaited her, but she was certain that the answer was waiting, just beyond the horizon of the ordinary world she had known. She stepped into the cold air, letting the winds embrace her as she walked out the door, the world outside covered in a soft dusting of snow. As she made her way through the town, the streets were eerily quiet, the only sound the crunch of snow beneath her boots. It was a peaceful kind of quiet, the kind that enveloped everything, leaving only the whispers of her thoughts. She had always found comfort in the quiet moments, but tonight, the silence felt heavier, filled with meaning. Every step she took felt as though it were part of something larger, something that was unfolding around her. The path she walked had become familiar over the years. She had walked it countless times before. Yet tonight, everything felt different. The air seemed charged, as though the very atmosphere was anticipating something. Elizabeth's heart beat a little faster with every step. She wasn't sure where the lights were, but she felt them drawing her forward, leading her deeper into the unknown. Eventually, she reached the edge of town, where the old church stood, its steeple rising against the night sky, silhouetted against the bright glow of the stars. Elizabeth paused for a moment, staring up at it, as if something about the church called to her. There was an unspoken connection here, a bond that stretched back to her childhood, when she had come here seeking solace during hard times. But tonight, it felt different. It wasn't the place she sought. It was something beyond it, something further. She continued her journey, following the road that wound out into the countryside, where the snow seemed to glitter under the pale moonlight. The quiet was profound, as if the world had fallen asleep, holding its breath. The further she walked, the colder the air became, but she didn't mind. In fact, the chill seemed to sharpen her senses, making every detail stand out in stark clarity. And then, in the distance, she saw them. The lights. They were faint at first, flickering like the faintest stars on the horizon. But as she walked closer, they became brighter, more defined, their glow casting a soft, golden hue over the snow-covered ground. The lights were strung along the trees, winding like a path leading through the forest, their warm glow contrasting with the icy air around them. Elizabeth's heart quickened. The path was there, as if waiting for her, stretching out before her like a ribbon of light through the darkness. She stood still for a moment, gazing at the path ahead. She felt a strange sense of awe, as though she were standing on the threshold of something monumental. The lights beckoned her forward, and she couldn't resist. The mystery, the allure of what lay beyond the glow, was too strong. The letters, the dreams, the hints, everything was leading here, to this very moment. Elizabeth took a deep breath, steadying herself before she stepped onto the path, letting the lights guide her as she walked forward, deeper into the night, deeper into whatever fate had in store for her. There was no turning back now. She had set the wheels of destiny in motion, and all she could do was follow. Chapter 11. Footsteps Through Frozen Dreams. The glow of the lights seemed to wrap around Elizabeth, guiding her with an unspoken promise. Each step she took on the narrow path felt like a silent conversation, as if the earth beneath her feet was acknowledging her presence, urging her forward. The lights flickered in an almost rhythmic pattern, casting their golden hue against the trees that flanked either side of the path, their branches reaching out like skeletal arms in the cold night air. The wind had picked up, rustling the bare branches, but it didn't matter. The lights were her only focus now, the only certainty in a world that was becoming increasingly unfamiliar. As she ventured deeper into the forest, the snow crunched beneath her boots, the sound muffled by the thick blanket of whiteness that surrounded her. The trees, stripped of their leaves, stood like silent sentinels, their shadows stretching long across the ground. It was eerily quiet, too quiet, as if the forest itself were holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. The only noise was the occasional rustle of wind through the branches, the soft, almost melodic sound of nature that only heightened the sense of suspense. It was strange how quickly the world had changed for her. Just hours ago, she had been in the warmth of her home, reading a letter that had made no sense. But now, standing in the midst of the dark forest, Elizabeth felt as if she were walking into another realm entirely. It was as if the world she had known, the familiar, comforting routine of everyday life, had melted away, leaving only this strange, mysterious path before her. The trees seemed to lean in closer, their shadows growing longer with every passing minute. Elizabeth had the sense that she wasn't alone, though no one was visible. The lights, so bright and inviting just moments before, now seemed to flicker in irregular intervals, casting brief shadows that danced across the snow. A chill ran through her, not from the cold, but from the feeling that something was watching her, waiting just beyond the edges of the light. But still, she pressed on. She didn't know why. There was no clear reason for her to continue down this path. Yet the pull was undeniable. The letter, the lights, the strange sense of destiny that had been building within her ever since she had first sent her letter to Santa. All of it had led to this point. And so, despite the unease swirling in her chest, she couldn't stop. She had to know what lay ahead. The further she walked, the thicker the forest grew, and the darker the sky became. The moon, once bright and full, was now hidden behind thick clouds, casting the path in deeper shadows. The lights ahead were now the only source of illumination, their soft glow flickering like a beacon in the blackness. They were still distant, but Elizabeth could sense they were drawing nearer, almost as if they were beckoning her, calling her towards something she could not yet understand. And then, as if to answer her unspoken question, the first of the whispers began. At first, it was nothing more than a faint rustling, like the soft murmur of wind through the trees. But as Elizabeth continued down the path, the whispers grew louder, clearer. It wasn't wind. It was a voice, a chorus of voices, all speaking in a language she couldn't quite comprehend. They seemed to come from all around her, a soft, eerie hum that seemed to rise from the earth itself, filling the air with an intangible sense of anticipation. Elizabeth froze, her heart hammering in her chest. The world around her felt suddenly different, as though she had stepped into a dream. A world where the rules no longer applied. The whispers seemed to grow louder, closer, though she couldn't pinpoint their source. They were everywhere. She strained to listen, trying to catch a single word, a single meaning, but it was all jumbled, a mixture of sounds and sensations that sent a chill up her spine. It was then that she saw them, the figures, just beyond the reach of the lights. At first, they were nothing more than shadows, flickering in and out of view, like faint silhouettes dancing just out of her line of sight. Elizabeth squinted, trying to make out their forms, but they remained elusive, their shapes shifting with the movement of the trees, the flickering of the lights. The whispers seemed to come from them, rising and falling with each step she took. She couldn't see their faces, but she could feel their presence, like an invisible weight pressing down on her chest. She should have been afraid. She should have turned back. But for some reason, Elizabeth didn't. Instead, she took another step and another. It was as though she were in a trance, drawn deeper into the forest, deeper into the unknown. The whispers grew louder still, and the figures began to take shape, their outlines becoming clearer as she drew closer. They weren't human, at least not in the way Elizabeth understood. They seemed otherworldly, like ghosts of the forest, shadows made of mist and moonlight, drifting in and out of the trees. As she moved closer, one of the figures turned, its form becoming more distinct. It was tall, thin, its limbs long and unnaturally slender, its head bowed as if in deep contemplation. The air around it seemed to shimmer, as if it were not entirely of this world. Elizabeth's breath caught in her throat, and for a moment, She was frozen, unable to move or look away. But the figure did not approach. It remained still, watching her with an intensity that made her skin crawl. The whispers seemed to fade into the background, replaced by a deep, resonating hum that seemed to vibrate through the very earth beneath her feet. It was as if the forest itself had become alive, pulsing with energy, waiting for something to happen. And then, as quickly as it had appeared, the figure vanished, swallowed by the darkness of the trees. The light from the path flickered again, casting long, eerie shadows across the snow. Elizabeth's heart was pounding in her chest, her mind racing to process what she had just seen. Had it been real? Or was it just a trick of the light, a figment of her imagination? She wasn't sure. But she knew one thing for certain. The path ahead was no longer just a journey. It was a quest, a test, and whatever waited at the end of it would change her life forever. The lights ahead seemed to flicker once more, like a silent invitation. Without another thought, Elizabeth took a step forward, her resolve hardening. She couldn't turn back now, not when she had come so far. The forest seemed to hold its breath as she moved forward, the whispers returning in soft murmurs, the figures fading in and out of view like phantoms of the night. The path was still there, still glowing faintly in the distance, but now, it felt like the beginning of something much larger. The answers she had sought were just ahead, waiting for her to find them. And she would, no matter what it took. Chapter 12. The Key to a Forgotten Door. The path had become a winding maze, leading Elizabeth deeper into the heart of the forest. The flickering lights seemed to pulse in time with her heartbeat, their golden glow illuminating the snow-covered ground, casting long shadows that stretched and danced like living things. The air was thick with the scent of pine and frost, the world around her holding a silence that was both peaceful and unnerving. It was as if the forest itself was waiting, watching, anticipating something that was yet to unfold. As she walked, Elizabeth's mind continued to race. The encounter with the figures, the ghostly shapes that had drifted in and out of sight, was still fresh in her mind. She had seen them, she was certain of it. But what did they mean? What were they trying to tell her? The whispers that had filled the air had not been random. They had been deliberate, each note a soft but pressing urgency, as though the forest itself was speaking to her in a language older than time. She had never been one to believe in the supernatural, but tonight, in this strange place, nothing felt ordinary. The trees, their branches bare and reaching like twisted arms, seemed to be alive with a hidden energy, as though the very woods were breathing, exhaling in the cold night. The deeper she ventured, the stronger the feeling grew. A sense that something powerful was at work here, something far beyond her understanding. The wind had picked up once again, carrying with it a soft, almost imperceptible sound, like a distant hum. It was not the rustling of the trees, nor the whisper of the snow beneath her boots. It was something else, something more. The sound seemed to echo through the forest, growing louder, then softer, as if it were moving, following her. Elizabeth could feel her pulse quicken as the sound grew nearer, the hum vibrating in the air around her. And then, ahead, the lights began to fade. Not completely, but enough for her to notice. They grew dimmer, their warm glow turning pale, as though they were being swallowed by the darkness that surrounded her. It was at this moment that Elizabeth felt it, the pull. It was subtle at first, like a tug in the back of her mind, urging her to step off the path. The lights were no longer guiding her forward, but rather retreating behind her, urging her to explore what lay beyond the visible world. Without thinking, her feet led her off the path. She moved slowly, cautiously, as if walking through a dream, the cold air pressing against her skin like an invisible force. The trees around her seemed to close in, their branches curling overhead, forming a canopy of shadows that blocked out the faint light of the moon. The hum grew louder now, a low, resonant vibration that seemed to come from the very ground beneath her. It was as if the earth itself were alive, its heartbeat syncing with hers. Elizabeth's breath came in short, shallow gasps as she stepped further into the unknown. The snow beneath her feet had grown thicker, the crunch of her boots muffled by the heavy blanket of white that had accumulated. The further she ventured, the more the world seemed to shift. The trees, once distant and unmoving, now seemed to lean toward her, their branches groaning with the weight of the snow and the unseen forces that pressed upon them. The world around her felt as though it were closing in, suffocating her with its silence. It was then that she saw it, a faint glow, not far ahead. It was small, faint, and not quite like the lights that had led her this far. This light seemed different, cooler, more distant, but still undeniable. The hum grew louder as she approached it, the sound vibrating through her chest. Her instincts told her to turn back, but there was no turning back now. The pull was too strong. As she neared the source of the glow, Elizabeth realized it was not a light at all, but a strange, ethereal mist that seemed to rise from the snow itself. It shimmered in the cold air, a soft blue hue that seemed to pulse in time with the hum. It was as if the mist was alive, swirling and shifting in the night, dancing with a rhythm all its own. Elizabeth stood at the edge of it, watching in awe as the mist swirled around her, its presence both beautiful and unsettling. There was something ancient about the mist, something primordial that spoke of old magic, of secrets hidden deep within the earth. Elizabeth could feel it, the weight of it pressing down on her, filling her with a sense of urgency, as though she had uncovered something forbidden. Her hands shook slightly as she reached out, hesitant, but compelled by something far beyond her understanding. The moment her fingers brushed the mist, a shock of cold ran through her, a sudden jolt that made her gasp. It was not a physical cold, but a coldness that seemed to pierce her very soul. The mist reacted to her touch, swirling around her fingers as if acknowledging her presence. For a brief moment, Elizabeth felt a deep sense of connection, as though she had tapped into something much larger than herself, something that had been waiting for her all along. It was as if the mist had been calling her, guiding her here, to this exact moment in time. Then, without warning, the mist began to dissipate, melting away like snow in the warmth of the sun. The glow faded, the hum fading with it. In its place, there was only silence, profound, overwhelming silence. Elizabeth stood in the clearing, her breath coming fast and shallow, her mind reeling from what she had just experienced. She didn't know what she had just uncovered, but she knew one thing for sure. This was no ordinary place. Whatever lay ahead was something far beyond her comprehension, a mystery that would reveal itself only when the time was right. She had crossed a threshold now, one from which there was no return. Whatever secrets the forest held, she would have to uncover them, for they were now part of her journey. Elizabeth had no idea what was waiting for her at the end of this path, but she knew that she had already begun to uncover the truth. The snow was still falling lightly around her, the world as quiet as it had ever been. But Elizabeth was no longer alone. The forest had shifted once again, its secrets now a part of her, its mysteries waiting to be unraveled. Chapter 13. A Letter Never Sent. Elizabeth stood motionless in the clearing, her breath still shaky from the strange encounter with the mist. The cold air seemed to freeze her in place, her limbs heavy, as though the forest itself was watching her, waiting. She glanced around, but the trees were no longer simply silent observers. They felt more like silent guardians, their thick trunks stretching up toward the sky, the branches heavy with snow. The whispering hum that had filled the air moments ago was gone, leaving an eerie stillness behind. as if the entire forest held its breath, awaiting something she couldn't yet understand. The path she had taken was no longer clear. The footprints she had left behind were covered by the fresh blanket of snow, erasing all evidence of her presence. She tried to retrace her steps, but the trees and the snow had already begun to shift, subtly, as if the forest itself was reorganizing itself, its secrets being rearranged for reasons she couldn't comprehend. The wind had calmed, but the silence that followed was profound, pressing against her ears, a weight that filled the space around her and within her. But something inside Elizabeth, something deeper than fear or uncertainty, pushed her forward. The pull she had felt before, the one that had led her to the mist, was still there, subtly tugging at her chest, urging her to keep moving. The forest may have been silent, but she was not alone. She could feel it now, the presence of something ancient, hidden beneath the surface of the earth, nestled deep within the pines. A pulse, a rhythm that matched her own, flowing just below the quiet world around her. There was no mist, no glowing light to guide her this time, but Elizabeth didn't need it. The feeling in her chest had grown stronger, the pull more insistent. The trees before her opened slightly, as if parting to reveal a new path, one shrouded in darkness, but inviting her nonetheless. She stepped forward, the sound of her boots crunching softly against the snow the only noise she could hear. Her heartbeat echoed in her ears, as loud as the steady rhythm of a drum, a beat that urged her onward. The deeper she walked, the more she felt the forest shifting around her, moving with her, pulling her closer to something or someone. The trees seemed to lean in, their gnarled branches swaying ever so slightly, and Elizabeth's breath became shallow, her steps more deliberate. She had no idea where she was going, but something told her she had to continue. There was no turning back now. As she walked, a strange sense of familiarity began to envelop her. She had been here before. This was not the first time she had felt the pull of the forest. It was as if her very being recognized the rhythm, the quiet hum of the woods, as though she had always been connected to it, but had simply forgotten. She had seen glimpses of it before, in her dreams, in the moments when she had closed her eyes and allowed herself to drift into the unknown. This place, this eerie, snow-covered forest, was a part of her, woven into her very soul. But why now? Why had the forest called to her in such a way? The questions twisted in her mind, but she had no answers. All she could do was follow the path, deeper and deeper, until she reached the heart of the forest, where she could feel the pulse beating stronger than ever. Each step felt like a moment closer to something that was just out of reach, yet felt so undeniably close. After what seemed like hours, Elizabeth reached a small clearing, the trees parting just enough to allow a sliver of moonlight to break through the canopy. She paused at the edge, her eyes scanning the space before her. The clearing was unlike any she had seen before. The ground was covered in soft moss, the kind that felt cool and damp to the touch. A small brook trickled through the clearing, the sound of water moving over smooth stones like a song, soft, soothing, but with an undercurrent of urgency. In the center of the clearing stood an ancient stone pedestal, worn by time but still standing tall. The stone was covered in a thick layer of snow, but even in its stillness, Elizabeth could feel that it was alive, imbued with something that resonated in the very air around her. The same rhythm, the same pulse that had been calling her, now grew stronger here, as if it were emanating from the pedestal itself. It was almost as if the pedestal was the heart of the forest, a conduit for the forces that controlled the woods, and Elizabeth could feel its power radiating into her, a warmth that spread through her chest. She stepped closer to the pedestal, her hand trembling as she reached out to touch the stone. The moment her fingers brushed against the cool surface, the air around her seemed to shift, a wave of energy passing through her. Her vision blurred for a moment, and when it cleared, the scene before her had changed. The snow-covered forest had vanished, replaced by a landscape she did not recognize. She stood in a vast hall, the walls lined with intricate carvings and symbols that pulsed with the same rhythm she had felt in the forest. The air was thick with the scent of old wood and herbs, and the sound of distant chanting filled the space. Elizabeth's heart raced as she realized she was no longer standing in the forest, but somewhere else, somewhere far removed from everything she had known. She was no longer alone. Shadows danced along the walls, figures that she couldn't quite make out, their movements fluid and graceful, as if they were part of the very air itself. The hum from earlier grew louder, almost deafening, as it reverberated through the hall. Elizabeth's body felt light, as though she were floating, caught in the current of something far greater than herself. And then, as suddenly as it had come, the vision disappeared. The forest returned, the snow, the trees, the soft trickle of the brook at her feet. Elizabeth blinked, trying to steady her breath. She had not imagined it. What she had just seen was real, part of a larger world, a place that existed beyond the physical realm. But what did it mean? What was this power that had drawn her here? The hum of the forest grew quieter once more, but the pull inside her chest remained, persistent and heavy. There was something she was meant to find, something she had already seen, something that would reveal itself when the time was right. Elizabeth stood in the clearing, her hands still resting on the cold stone pedestal, her thoughts swirling in confusion. The forest had given her a glimpse of its truth, but the answer was still hidden, wrapped in mystery, waiting to be uncovered. The only thing she knew for certain was that she was no longer simply a visitor in the woods. She was a part of them, woven into the very fabric of this place, and she had a role to play in its story. Chapter 14: Truth Under the Evergreen. The snow had begun to fall heavily once again, blanketing the clearing in soft, unbroken layers. Elizabeth stood still, her breath forming small clouds in the frigid air. The world felt different now, a place suspended between two realities, the familiar, the mundane, and the ethereal, the unknown. The forest, once cold and distant, now pulsed with life, as though the trees themselves whispered to her, urging her onward, further into the depths of the wilderness. The pedestal beneath her fingertips still hummed with the energy she had felt earlier, but now it was more than that. The pulse was almost like a heartbeat, slow, deliberate, insistent. She could feel it in her chest, aligning with the rhythm of her own body. It beckoned her, compelling her to uncover what lay hidden within the forest's ancient bones. Something was waiting for her, something important, something that the forest needed her to find. She pulled her hand away from the stone, the coldness of it lingering on her skin. The moment she did, the clearing seemed to shift, as if the world around her was rearranging itself. The trees that had stood so silent and unmoving now seemed to lean in, closer, as if watching her every move. The wind had returned, but it no longer carried the same sharp bite. Instead, it whispered gently through the branches, like a secret shared between the forest and the night. With slow, deliberate steps, Elizabeth turned, her senses heightened by the sensation that she was no longer alone. The path before her seemed to stretch into the heart of the woods, but it was different now, as if the trees themselves had opened a new way for her to follow. The same pull, that deep, inexplicable force, tugged at her chest once more, urging her forward. The wind carried something else this time. Voices, faint but unmistakable. At first, she thought it was simply the rustling of the trees, a trick of the mind. But the whispers grew clearer, sharper. The voices were not of animals or of the forest. They were human, soft and melodic, but distant, as if they were coming from another time, another place. They floated in and out of her consciousness, weaving around her, teasing her thoughts, urging her to remember something that felt just beyond her reach. She stopped in her tracks, standing at the edge of a small ravine, the dark water below reflecting the pale moonlight. The voices seemed to come from that very place, rising from the depths of the earth, flowing up from the rocks and the water. They were not clear words, not sentences, but fragments of something familiar, something that felt connected to her, as though they were speaking in a language that her soul knew, even if her mind did not. Elizabeth's heart quickened. She could feel the weight of their presence, the urgency in their tones. The water, once still, now began to ripple, though no wind stirred it. The surface shimmered in the moonlight, revealing glimpses of shadows beneath the dark, clear water, shapes that writhed and twisted in the depths as though they were alive. They were there, waiting for her. They had always been there. The whispering voices began to swell, their intensity growing with each passing moment. She could not understand the words, but she could feel their meaning, their sorrow, their desperation. They were calling to her, calling her by a name she could almost remember, a name that danced at the edges of her thoughts, always just out of reach. With a tremor in her hands, Elizabeth knelt at the edge of the ravine, her fingers brushing the surface of the water. The coldness shot through her, but it was not the sharp sting of winter. This was something deeper, something ancient. She gazed into the water, her reflection flickering and warping beneath the surface. The shadows beneath the water grew darker, deeper, until they seemed to take form. Human figures, faces she could almost recognize. The voices rose to a crescendo, a chorus of longing and loss, and Elizabeth felt the pressure build in her chest, the sensation of being drawn into something larger, something that transcended time and space. The shadows beneath the water shifted, their faces coming into sharper focus, each one a pale, distorted image of a person she did not know, yet felt as if she should. There were no words now, only the haunting sound of their cries, echoes of forgotten souls trapped between worlds. Elizabeth's breath caught in her throat. The faces in the water, though distorted, now seemed to look directly at her, their eyes filled with an emotion she could not place. Fear? Hope? A longing for something lost? She could not say. But there was a moment of recognition, a feeling that this was not just a vision, but a memory, her memory. Without thinking, Elizabeth reached into the water, her hand trembling as it sank below the surface. The coldness of the water wrapped around her fingers, pulling her deeper, but she did not resist. The shadows beneath the water pressed closer, their forms solidifying as if reaching out to her. Her heart raced, her chest tightening with the intensity of the moment. She could almost hear them now, their voices clearer than ever, speaking not just in whispers but in unison, calling her name. The name was on the tip of her tongue, but she could not quite grasp it. It was a name she knew, but could not remember. A name that felt both foreign and familiar at the same time. The figures in the water moved closer, their faces now inches from hers. She could feel the cold, wet air around them, could sense the desperation in their touch. But before she could pull herself deeper into the vision, the world around her flickered. The water churned, and the figures vanished. The voices fell silent. Elizabeth gasped, snapping her hand out of the water as if burned. The clearing returned to stillness, the whispers gone, leaving only the faint echo of something forgotten in her mind. She stumbled backward, her heart pounding in her chest, her mind swirling with confusion and dread. The forest was quiet again, its pulse fading to nothing, leaving her with the haunting sensation of having touched something that was never meant to be known. She stood there, the cold seeping into her bones, unsure of what had just happened, unsure of what she had seen. But one thing was certain, She was no longer the same person who had wandered into these woods. The whispers, the shadows, the faces in the water, they were all part of her now, and she would never forget them. The forest was silent, but Elizabeth could still hear the faint echo of the forgotten voices, a reminder of the mysteries that lay hidden in the depths of the earth, waiting to be uncovered. Chapter 15. The Heart's Final Seal. The snow fell steadily, blanketing the forest in a serene and impenetrable silence. Elizabeth stood at the edge of the clearing once more, her body trembling, but not from the cold. The winter chill no longer mattered, not in the way it once had. It was as if the very atmosphere had changed, as if she had crossed over into another realm altogether, one where the past, present, and future existed in a suspended state. She had seen the shadows beneath the water, the faces that had stared back at her with such familiarity and longing. She had heard the voices calling her name, whispering secrets that threatened to unravel her understanding of the world. But now, in this quiet moment, there was no sound, no movement, only the stillness of the snow, the frozen air, and her thoughts swirling with the weight of everything she had witnessed. Her breath misted in the air as she exhaled slowly, the memories of what she had seen still fresh in her mind. They were all still there, lingering in the edges of her consciousness, the faces, the voices, the water. They had called her to this place, to this exact moment. And now, with the forest seemingly holding its breath, she felt the final pull, the last thread that would draw her into the depths of the mystery that had been waiting for her all along. She could still feel the faint pulse beneath her fingertips when she had touched the pedestal, soft, like a heartbeat. She had thought it was a part of the forest, but now she realized it was something much more, something that resonated with her in a way she could not fully comprehend. The pedestal had been a doorway, a threshold between two worlds, and by touching it, she had unlocked something deep within herself. Elizabeth's heart ached with a longing that was impossible to place. It was not fear, not entirely. No, it was something much deeper, a yearning for a connection she had never known. She had been drawn here, guided by forces beyond her understanding, and now she could feel it. The presence of the unseen, the ones who had called her, was still with her, closer than ever before. The wind carried their faint whispers, like a reminder of something forgotten, something she was meant to remember. She moved cautiously through the snow, each step heavier than the last. The weight of the forest seemed to press in on her from all sides. She passed the stone pillar again, its ancient surface smooth and cold to the touch. She hesitated for a moment, wondering if she should touch it once more. But something inside her told her that she had already done what was necessary, that the answers she sought were no longer hidden in the stone, but within herself. The world around her shifted, though she could not explain how. The trees seemed to lean closer, their branches heavy with snow, and the air grew thick with the scent of pine. She walked deeper into the woods, no longer searching for something physical, but for something more profound. She did not know what it was, only that it was waiting for her, just ahead. Her steps led her to the edge of a small clearing, and there, at the center, was a tree unlike any she had seen before. Its trunk was gnarled and twisted, its branches stretching out like fingers toward the sky. It seemed to radiate an otherworldly light, faint but steady, as if it were alive with a force that pulsed in time with her own heartbeat. Elizabeth stepped forward, drawn to the tree, her body moving on its own accord. The moment she touched its bark, a wave of warmth flooded her, starting from her fingertips and spreading through her entire body. It was a warmth unlike any she had felt before, deep, comforting, and yet somehow unnerving. It was as if the tree was alive, breathing with her, sharing something that was both ancient and eternal. Her mind was flooded with images, visions of the past, of faces she had seen before in the water, of memories not her own but intertwined with her soul. The shadows beneath the water shifted, their forms now clearer than before. They were not just figures, they were pieces of a story that had been lost in time, forgotten by the world, and now they were telling her their truth. Elizabeth's eyes fluttered closed as the vision deepened, her senses overwhelmed by the intensity of it. The tree seemed to pulse with life, each throb matching the beat of her heart. She could see the people, their faces now vivid in her mind, those who had called to her, those whose voices she had heard in the water. They were familiar, but strange, as though they were part of her, yet not. She felt a tear slip down her cheek, not from sorrow, but from a profound sense of connection. The story was hers, but it was not hers alone. It was a part of the forest, a part of the earth, a part of the people who had once lived and loved here. The voices she had heard were not just echoes of the past. They were the remnants of something that had never truly left. Elizabeth's hand tightened on the bark, and as if in response, the tree's energy surged, flowing through her. She felt her own spirit shift, as if something inside her had awakened. A piece of her soul that had been dormant, waiting for this moment. The warmth from the tree spread outward, wrapping her in a protective embrace, a gift that was both an ending and a beginning. In the distance, the faint sound of bells chimed, soft and melodic, like the tolling of a distant memory. The Christmas bells. Her heart leaped in recognition, and for the first time, she felt the full weight of her connection to this place. The whispers, the shadows, the voices, they had led her here for a reason. And now, the final piece of the puzzle was in place. Elizabeth took a deep breath, her body calm now, her mind at peace. The truth had been revealed to her, not in words, but in the depth of the forest, in the warmth of the tree, in the memories that were now hers to keep. She was no longer an outsider, no longer someone lost in the shadows. She had become part of this place, part of the story that had been waiting for her to remember. With one final glance at the tree, she turned and walked away, the snow now falling gently around her, a soft blanket covering the ground. She was no longer alone, not in the way she had once felt. The forest, the voices, the whispers, they were all with her now, a part of her, always. As she disappeared into the night, the wind whispered one last time, its soft breath carrying the final gift, an understanding that no memory, no love, no story was ever truly forgotten. It lived on, in the hearts of those who remembered, and in the places where they had once walked. And so, the final chapter of Elizabeth's story ended, but it was only the beginning of something much greater, something that would live on, long after the snow had melted and the bells had stopped ringing.